There's a lot of them, but I'm only going to be covering the main ones that we are going to be using. So before we go on, I'm just going to show you what a pseudo-selector actually is. So usually what you would do is after a selector, you would add a colon and then the name of the pseudo-selector. So this is just an example of one of them. And then the properties will apply normally. Now watch what happens when I hover over our H2 here. You can see that it's working perfectly, and when we hover over it, it is turning red. Now obviously it doesn't apply to this subtitle or the services part here, because again these are separate classes, and obviously with specificity and everything like that, they won't apply. So there we go. We have everything working here, and that's one of the pseudo selectors, which is hover. So let's move on to some of the next ones. Now there's also two that I'd like to talk about, which is first child and last child. So the concept behind child and parent elements is that right here, if we look, actually this is a little bit complicated example. Let's look at this unordered list here. We have a UL unordered list, and then we have 3 LIs, okay? So pretty much this is going to be the first child because it's placed inside of the UL. The second is going to be the second child, and then this is going to be the third child. So you can see here that this is kind of the relationship between child and parent, and what we can actually do is specify which one we want to select. So if I go over here and select all ULs, and then of course the colon for the pseudo selector, and select first child. Now I'm just going to say set the color to steel blue as well. Okay? So I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see that it's not working. Now although it might seem like you want to put the UL first, obviously because again, you're looking for the first child of the UL. This isn't actually how you're supposed to write it. Instead, you're supposed to write the element that you're trying to select, which in this case is our list item, or our LI. So now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that the first one here is going to be blue. It's a little bit of a confusing rule to get around, but once you get used to it, it becomes very easy. We can also change this to last, or last child, like this. And then what's going to happen is it's going to select the last one. Now there's also one more that I'd like to talk about quickly, which is nth child. So I'm just going to show you how this thing works. Nth child, and then in brackets, you put the number here. So what you're going to put here is pretty much what number of the child you want to style. In this case, I want every second LI child to be colored steel blue. So throughout the page, every second LI that is inside of that is the child element is going to be styled blue. Go ahead and refresh the page. You can see that works there. So there's actually one more selector that I want to talk about, at least for children, and that is the only child selector. So I think it makes perfect sense. Pretty much what we're trying to look for is something that there is only one child inside of it. So for example, nothing on this page here actually has one child. But why don't we go ahead and add that? So under this list, I'm just going to temporarily remove these here, just like that. All right, let's go ahead and save, make sure it's working. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and select this. So I'm going to say LI, like that, and I'm going to say only child. So pretty much what this is saying is for every LI that is the only child of its parent. And you can see this, the UL, this only has one child. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a color of purple, for example. And you can see that it works perfectly. But what were to happen if I tried this on, let's just say, for example, the TDs here, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and add a new one, TD, only child. And I'm also going to give this a color of purple. Just like that. Now let's go ahead and refresh and see what's going on. All right. So you can see that that TD right here, it's somewhere in this table, nothing's actually happening. That's because, as we can see here, there is nothing on this page where there's only one TD as a child. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Sometimes pseudo selectors won't actually style anything if they don't exist. So there we go. That's pretty much for the basic children kind of pseudo selectors. But let's move on to some other pseudo selectors. Now, there are selectors of this type that are actually specific to certain elements, and one of them is the anchor tag, or the A tag. So I'm just going to go ahead and create an anchor tag under this H2 here. A, and I'm just going to give it a link or an endpoint of Google. So just like that. Okay, there we go. So in here, I'm just going to say click here to go to Google. Pretty simple A tag. Hopefully everyone knows how to do this. There we go. We have our link there. So I click on it, takes me there. Pretty standard stuff. Now, we can actually create pseudo selectors for this. So I'm going to be giving you 2 for now. Now, there are many, many more, but these are the 2 main ones you need to focus on. The rest of them are kind of generalized, and these are the main 2 that you're going to be using. So I'm going to create them here. And remember, you're using the element name. You can use the class if you want. It's not limited to single element names. Actually, why don't I go ahead and do that? I'm going to give it an ID, because again, we only have one of these on the page. I'm going to give it an ID of Google link, just like that. So now I'm going to go ahead and reference that in here. So remember, it's just the name of the selector, Google-link in this case, and then the colon. So here I'm going to go ahead and say link. Okay, so this is the first pseudo selector, and then there's also a second one. Now don't worry about what I'm typing for now. I'll explain both of these in just a second. Alright, so let's look at the first one here. Google link. Pretty much what this is saying is, if you've ever been on a web page, you know that there is a difference between before you click on the link and after. There's kind of some stylistic changes. So that's where pseudo selectors actually come into play. The website has those defined properties, and they actually change the way that a link looks before and after it is clicked. So I'm going to go ahead and do it here. Link is the unvisited link, remember? So I'm going to go ahead and give it a color of blue. And then when it's clicked, I'm going to go ahead and give it a color of red. Sorry, I typed blue there. Remember, usually the default is that it is going to be purple, like this color here. Let's go ahead and refresh the page. You can see that it's actually red now. Now, obviously, I can't really go back in time and change the link so that it doesn't look clicked. But you can see how powerful these pseudo selectors are, because you can do so many different things. And once we learn more properties, you can actually change different parts of the page, and it becomes very powerful to use these pseudo selectors. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Alright, so there we go. We've covered most of the pseudo selectors. I'm actually going to go ahead and add that hover property there back in case anyone wants to use the project files. So there we go. We've covered everything here, and we've added all of our pseudo selectors. So like I said, there's many more. I've linked a couple articles that help you to look at all of the different pseudo selectors, and most of them you're not really going to use very often. They aren't useful in any way because usually you just use some basic pseudo selectors like hover and active, which I haven't actually covered, but things like that. So you're not really going to use all of them, but I just wanted to give you an introduction to the main ones so that when it comes time to use them, you have the tools to finish the job or create that effect that you've always wanted. All right, let's move on. Today, we're going to be looking at advanced selectors. So right now we've looked at our basic selectors, so our class selectors, element selectors, and ID selectors. And we've also looked at some pseudo selectors, which is very useful. But now we're going to look at some of the more advanced selectors. Now, you're not going to use these every day. They're not used very commonly, but it just shows what you can actually do with these selectors, because there is a lot. So there's a bunch of advanced selectors, and I'm actually going to be breaking these down into 2 parts. We're going to be looking first at our basic advanced selectors. And I know that sounds a little bit contradictory, but we'll get into that in just a second. And then after that, we're going to be talking about attribute selectors, which are probably the hardest type of selector to get used to. All right, let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is how you actually set up these selectors. Now, these sometimes contain 1, 2, or sometimes even 3 elements in one selector. So I'm going to be going through these and talking about how they all work. So the first selector I'm going to be talking about is something called the adjacent sibling selector. So pretty much what this does is select every single element that directly follows a different element. So I'll show you how to set this up. Let's first take a look at our HTML page over here. Now you can see we have our services, which is our H2, and then we have an A tag. Now, first thing I want to do is actually go ahead and get rid of these 2. I'm going to actually comment them out. You can do this with Control/, just like that. So if you type Control/, it comments it, which pretty much just renders it useless. It doesn't run or anything like that. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and set this up. So I want to be able to apply styles to every A tag or anchor tag that comes directly after an H2. So the way to set this up is all you have to do is go the element that you want to be the first element. So in this case, it's going to be our H2. And then afterwards, it's going to be the element that you want after, which is our A tag. So you want H2 plus A. So this is pretty much saying every anchor tag that follows an H2. So then we can pretty much just set the style however we want. So I'm going to say color is red, just like that. Now remember, there is no pseudo selector on this. If you could add it if you wanted to, because this is still a selector, remember. But I'm not going to add any. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see it turns red again. So that's the first type of selector. Next thing I want to look at is the general sibling combinator or selector. So this is a little bit more difficult to understand, but all in good time, once you get used to it, it becomes much easier to understand. So pretty much what the general sibling selector does is goes for the same kind of idea as this selector here. It looks for elements that go directly after one another, except they have to be sharing the same parent, okay? So, for example, let's see our input here. Our form, we have an input and a text area, or a button followed by a text area, for example. So what we're going to do here is I want to style every button that's followed by a text area, except in this case, they have to share the same parent. So what we're going to do is go and say every button, which is going to be the next one, or the final one, which is A here. So sorry, it's actually going to be text area, right? Because that's the first element here, which is our text area. And then this symbol followed, and then it's going to be our button, like that. So this is saying every button that is followed or that is after a text area, but they're in the same parent. So from here, we can go and style it however we want. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just say the color is purple. Oops. Now if we go ahead and refresh, you can see that the button color is purple. So like I said, the main difference between these two is that the first one is going to be styling elements that follow each other no matter where they are on the scale. So if you actually look up here, they don't share any parent. They're completely separate elements. Whereas here, they have to follow each other. And I'll actually demonstrate that quickly. If we change this to a plus here and refresh, the style is still going to work because they are directly preceded. But the only thing is if they aren't, so for example, I'm just going to actually move this button out of the form. Just like that. Whoops. Seems like the button disappeared there. Let's go ahead and redo that. Okay, so we have the button back. Now if I'm going to go ahead and change this back to our symbol there, and if I go ahead and refresh, you can see that the button right there, it doesn't actually have that styling anymore, because although they directly follow each other, they're not under the same parent. So that's just one minor difference. All right, let's move on to the next one. It's called the child selector. So this is probably the most basic out of all of these advanced selectors. And pretty much what it is saying is every single child of a certain element. So I'll give you an example here. We have an LI and a UL. This is pretty basic. All you have to do is type UL, which is going to be our parent, and then this symbol or the greater than symbol, and LI. So this is going to say every single LI inside of a UL. Open up the brackets, and let's set the color this time to blue. I'm just going to say that. And remember, specificity is at play here. Now, like I said, the specificity rules, once you use these advanced selectors, get quite complicated. But for example, if we actually look at the LI here, the style for this, we can see that the LI with the pseudo selector is actually more specific than this general selector. So I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. Now if we refresh the page, you can see that it's blue. So that's just one thing to keep in mind with these advanced selectors. They can get pretty complicated, and that's why we use the numbers, the zeros, ones, twos, things like that, is to be able to classify these once we get and start using these advanced selectors. But like I said, usually you won't use these in your general use. So I'm not going to go over specificity, especially because usually you'll group up all of these styles into one selector. Okay, so that's the child selector. The next one is very similar to the child selector, but instead of having direct children, there's actually something called a descendant. So I'm just going to go ahead and edit this a little bit. I'm going to have an li, okay? But then I'm going to create an ordered list inside of the, Actually, I need to create an li and put the ordered list inside of that. So pretty much what's going on here is I'm creating an ordered list or a numbered list inside of a list item that is inside of a UL. It's a little bit complicated, but we'll get to that in just a second. So I'm going to create an li inside of this, and I'm going to say my numbered list item, just like that. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see we have a list item here with our item. All right. So let's get started on using this descendant selector. So I'm going to get started. First thing I want to do is actually set this up. So first thing we're going to have is the parent. Okay. So in this case, it's going to be our UL. Remember, because that's the top level. But then I'm going to select the li here, but I'm not going to put our greater than symbol. So that's the big difference. This is the descendant selector, and then this is going to be our child selector. So that's just the main difference. It's very easy to miss. Just make sure that you don't mess that up. So now I'm going to select the color and set it to, for now, let's just say green. All right. Now let's go ahead and refresh the page. And you can see that all of the LIs inside of there are going to be green, right? Only problem is our ordered list right here is actually purple, right? And of course, you know, our list here is getting a little bit complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. Remember, this is a very specific selector. Now, if I go ahead and refresh, both of them are green. All right. So what you need to take away from this is pretty much what this is saying is any LI that eventually boils back or propagates up, if you have done any programming before, that goes up to a UL. Okay. So I'll just show you what that means. In this case, the LI is a direct child of the UL, right? But then we have another LI in here, which is a child of an OL, which is a child of an LI, which is a child of the UL, right? So as you move up and up, it eventually comes back to the UL as the parent element. So the main difference you need to take away from this is that the child selector is selecting any direct children. So anything here would not apply because, or actually, this one wouldn't apply because the ordered list is actually a child of the LI, remember. But when you're using the descendant selector, what actually happens is if it is contained inside of a UL at all, then use or apply the styles. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate this now. Let's go ahead and actually remove this LI. Remember, because once you get to this point, CSS gets a little bit complicated. This is going to end up styling everything inside it. So I'm actually just going to remove this and leave it just the ordered list. So right now we have the ordered list as a child of the UL. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and you can see it still stays the same because we have this style applied. But why don't we go ahead and remove this? What do you think is going to happen? Well, you can see here that this stays blue, remember, because of our direct child selector, but then this doesn't have any style at all. So this LI works perfectly. It is a direct child of the UL, which means it's going to be colored with the style specified. The only problem is this LI is a direct child of the ordered list, which is completely separate from this one. So the styles aren't going to be applied on this one. On the other hand, if we did have our descendant selector enabled, it's going to style both of them because remember, the LI is a child of the OL and the OL is a child of the UL. So just keep that in mind. There's a big difference between the two. You might be able to miss it. It could really mess up your code. So just make sure to keep that in mind. All right, so those are pretty much the basic advanced selectors. Those are the four that you're mainly going to use. Again, there's many more, but they are quite difficult, and we're not going to cover them because they're not very useful. So there we go. Those are the four selectors that you can use. Go ahead and practice them as much as you want. You know, try messing them around, open up some HTML files, and just see what you can do with them. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, I am going to be talking about the last type of selector. These are called attribute selectors. They're a little bit complicated once you get started, but once we actually start using them, they become very easy to use. So first of all, what is an attribute selector? Well, as we know, in HTML, we can actually add attributes to all of our elements. So for example, this image here has an attribute of source, which tells the image tag where the source of the image is. But what we can actually do in CSS is use these to our advantage. We can select certain elements that for certain attributes and their values. So for example, let's go ahead and try and rewrite this subtitle class here. So we know if we go over here that all of our subtitle classes are used in H2s. So what I want to do is actually rewrite this in terms of our attribute selector. So what we do is first start off with our tag name, which is H2. But then inside of some squared brackets, what we do is type attribute is equal to value. Okay? So obviously, we're not going to do it like this. We're going to have to select some certain attribute. But what this allows us to do is actually select certain things or certain elements based on their attributes. So in this case, we want to select everything that has the attribute of class. And we want to make sure that the class itself is subtitle. Okay? Now, you do not need quotation marks for these. Unlike how they were in HTML, you can see we do need quotation marks. But in CSS, we don't actually need them. Alright, so there we go. We have rewritten our class here. But we've written it in a way that allows us to select it based on the attribute of it itself. So let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. You can see that they state exactly the same. Now nothing has changed. If I go ahead and change this back to .subtitle, just like that, and refresh the page, you can see nothing's changed. So that's pretty basic. Now it doesn't just have to be class. We can select it based on many different things. So for example, if I wanted to select this image over here, I'm going to go over to the bottom. I could say image, image. And then the source has to be equal to something. All right. So there we go. Now we've done that, but there's actually more than one type of selector. Now, usually this is the basic one where you just equate one side to the other, but there's actually many more types of selectors, which allow you to kind of modify the attribute selectors and make them much more powerful than they are right now. So how do we do this? Well, I'm going to be covering just a few of them with you today and showing you how you can use them. So we have two images on this page. Now, both of them are located in this image folder. Do you think that there's any way that we can select both of them in one go using an attribute selector? Well, there actually is. So here's what we have to do. First of all, let's find the common factor between these two images. They both are contained inside this folder. So they both definitely start with this path. /img/. Both of them are going to contain this. And if we actually go back and look, you can see that both images actually do contain this link here, wherever the other image is. There it is. So there we go. Now we've done that. But remember that this is direct equating. This has to be equal to this. And unfortunately, neither of them are equal to that. So how do you think we fix this? Well, all we have to do is put a caret behind the attribute, just like this. So what this says is every single image where the source contains or starts with this piece of information. What comes after it doesn't matter. But what we're doing is selecting all of the images where the source attribute starts with this value right here. So you can already see how powerful this is. Now, if we go ahead and refresh the page, obviously, we can't see anything because we didn't add any styles. But I'm going to go ahead and add a quick style for you. Now, you don't need to know how to do this. I'm actually going to make it a little bit more obvious. So you don't need to know how to do this. We're going to cover it later. But you can see now both images are covered in black. Okay? So there we go. That's just one way, one of the selectors we can do. We can also change this to a $sign. And in this case, it's going to be make sure that the source attribute ends with this value. Okay? So there we go. We can do that. Obviously, the style isn't going to work anymore because this doesn't apply. But there's also another one that we can do, which is using a star, or the multiplication symbol. And pretty much what this is if it contains it anywhere in the value, for beginning, end, middle, doesn't matter. As long as it contains this, it's going to be there. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and you can see now that works because both of them do contain this. So those are the three basic ones, but there's also some more complicated selectors. Now I'm going to go ahead and cover them, but you don't exactly need to know these because they're a little bit complicated. So I'm just going to go ahead and do them. The first one is called a white space attribute selector. So pretty much, if you don't know this already, you can actually add multiple classes to something in HTML. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add another class to these subtitles, and I'm just going to call it just something random, article subtitle. Obviously it's a little bit confusing, but just bear with me. So you can actually add multiple classes or multiple arguments separated by white spaces or spaces inside these attributes. Now obviously this is specific to some a very small number of attributes, but you can do this. Now just keep that in mind for now. What we're going to do is go forward and start using this. So I'm going to go ahead and select anything that contains this this class specifically. Now I could do, maybe the attribute selector where it ends in this or contains it, but there is another selector that we can use. So I'm going to go ahead and say h2, and of course the attribute is class, and it's this symbol, it's this symbol, okay, and then equals, and then our value. In this case, it's going to be our class, which is article subtitle. All right. So now we can go ahead and add whatever we want. So I'm actually going to go ahead and give it a background. Now again, you do not need to know what this is yet. I'm just trying to vary up the properties a little bit here. So let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. You can see that a green background has been added to this. I'm not going to try hovering over that. It's a little bit discomforting, but you can see that a green background has been added to it. Now this could be used for using a contain attribute selector, but this is a little bit more specific, and it only works for things that are separated by white space. So if you want to isolate certain elements that contain a certain class, for example, you can do it with these class attributes, and that would work perfectly. So the next selector I'm going to talk about is a little bit more complicated, and it's very similar to the first one that we talked about, which was the general attribute selector, the one where it's exact equality. But there's a little bit of a difference here. There's actually one exception to this. Now I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate it here, okay? So pretty much what this is saying is find every h2 where the class is either equal to directly article-subtitle or article-subtitle with a dash. So, and again, it does have to start with this. So it can't just be containing followed by a dash. It does have to start with this. So why would you want to use something like this? Why can't you just use the exact equality? Well, this is a pretty basic site right here. Now, we're not really doing anything complicated or any multiple style sheets or anything like that. But sometimes when you want to have multiple elements or you want to build libraries, you can create multiple elements that are followed by an ID. So for example, just list them here. I'm going to actually put this in a comment. So I could have subtitle dash and then some ID like that. Subtitle dash and then again some ID. So you can see why we would use something like this. Pretty much what you want to do is select everything that has subtitle and then the dash in it. And you're probably also wondering, okay, why can't you just use one of the other selectors, like something that starts with it? Well, sometimes this is contained in a chain, or sometimes there's multiple dashes, and on top of that, sometimes it may change. Maybe this could be in the middle of 15 other classes. So you can see why you'd want to use something like this. And although it's not used very commonly, it's still very important to know. All right, so those are pretty much all of the advanced attribute selectors. Like I said, you aren't going to use these very commonly. But again, it is good to know they are very powerful selectors. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Go ahead, like I said, with every single video, practice and just try using these selectors on your own. All of the project files are available on GitHub. The link to the repository was posted at the beginning of the course. So you can go ahead and check that out if you want to download the files and work with them. But other than that, there we go. That's pretty much it for selectors. Now we can actually move on and start using CSS. All right, let's move on. I'm not really going to talk a lot in this video because there's not really much to talk about, but this video and the next are very important because right now you're probably just piecing things together about the whole way that we use CSS. Now we've had to use a couple properties here and there, but you probably don't actually know what these brackets do or how selectors work or how any of this is actually put together. So that's what I'm going to be doing in the next few videos, is explaining how all of this comes together. And once we learn that, we can actually move on to the fun part, which is using CSS and styling this website. So first thing I want to explain is properties. Now, we've talked a little bit about properties here and there because we've needed them to demonstrate points on how selectors work. Now, obviously, it might have been better if we used properties first, but in my opinion, it's better that you learn selectors before you learn properties, because if you learn selectors first, you'll be able to understand the premise or the theory behind CSS and how things work. Whereas if you just learn properties first, then most of your focus will be on how the properties work and not the selectors. And I feel that it's much more important that you learn the selectors before the properties so that you can actually understand CSS and how it works as a whole. So that aside, let's move on to properties. Now, like I said, we've used these a little bit in the past, but we haven't actually talked about them in detail. So this is a property. Now, they're contained within selectors and they pretty much define the way that CSS is used or what goes into the CSS. Now, a selector is going to target the element, but the actual properties are what give it its change and what make it what it is. Without properties, then the selectors would be completely useless. So let's go ahead and talk about the parts of properties. Now, first of all, a colon is always needed. You cannot use a property without a colon and a semicolon. The colon comes after the property. Now, the property is pretty much defining what is going to change. Is it the color, the background, the positioning, the height, the width? There are so many properties out there, and they are all used in different ways. And then next is the value. Now, most of the time you can actually use multiple types of values, but for something like color, there are very specific rules that you need to use for them, and we're actually going to be learning those rules and how to use colors in the next section. But for now, just think of the value as a key, or well, not a key. The value is sort of the guideline towards the property. The value is like the value to the attribute. The attribute defines what's changing, and the value actually gives it that change. So just keep that in mind. So that's pretty much it for properties. It's very simple, and we're going to get lots of exposure to them as we move through the course. But for now, all you need to keep in mind is that properties have two components. The actual property itself, which is kind of the guideline on what's changing, followed by a colon, and then the value itself, which is going to be the change or the type of change that happens in our element. So what happens through our selector. And at the end of it all, you always put a semicolon. If we remove the semicolon, it's not going to work. So yeah, that's pretty much it for properties. Let's move on. So this is going to be the final video on, or in this section. We're not really going to be doing anything or styling the website, but for now, I just want to talk a little bit about a very important part of CSS. Now, this is pretty much going to define the way that you look at CSS. And we've written a lot of CSS code here. Well, we're not really looking at properties yet, but we've covered a lot of different selectors and how they work. But now we need to put the two together. We know what properties are, and we definitely know what selectors are. So we need to know how these two work together. Now, I've talked a little bit about this in the past, but we haven't actually gone through it in detail. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. So first of all, if you look at all of the CSS code, we can see a pattern evolve here. First of all, in every single one of these, there are these curly braces. And on top of that, in every single one, there is some italicized text, which is due to the development tool that we're using. But there's some italicized text, and then some other text here, and there's always a colon and a semicolon. And on top of that, before every first curly brace, there's always going to be some form of text here, which is our selectors. But how do these actually work together? So this is very important for something called the CSS general rule, and it's pretty much going to teach you how all CSS is supposed to look. So first of all, there's always 3 parts to your selector here. There is the selector itself, there's the curly braces, which actually represent something called a CSS block, and then there's the properties. So first of all, let's talk about the selector. Now, we all know that a selector defines what elements you're trying to collect or target on your HTML page. A selector can look any different way. It can look like this with some weird symbols, it can have colons and pseudo selectors, or it can just look something very plain like this. But we all know that they do something different, and over the last few videos, we've been covering what selectors actually do. So now what we're going to do is go through and I'm going to teach you how this selector plays in with everything else. So we have our selector over here. This could be anything, an element selector, pseudo selector, attribute selector, like one of these. But for now, we have our selector. So this is going to target some element on a page. Now the part we haven't talked about is something called the CSS block. So pretty much once you select something, you need to define all of your styles. And as we know, all of your styles have to go in between these 2 curly braces. So that's what we call a CSS block. The curly braces define the beginning and end of this block. And it can be empty. It doesn't need to have anything inside it. But what's going on here is this block is going to contain all of the styles that are then going to be targeted towards our selector. And then, of course, we have the properties. So all of these have only had one property, but you can actually do more than one property. So a property looks like this. Property, a colon, and then a value, and a semicolon. So the property is going to be the name of the actual style. This can be color, background, and we're going to learn a bunch of these throughout this course. But this could be anything. On the other hand, the value has to be sort of targeted or matching the style of the property. So for example, if this was a color, we can use pixels because pixels are for size. So there are many different ways that you can use these different values, and they all depend on your property. So what I didn't show you is you can actually have more than one property. Now these can be in any style as long as they have the semicolon and the colon, and they come inside the block. So this can be property 2 and value 2. And you can put pretty much as many styles as you want in here. So for example, if you wanted to style a subtitle and you wanted to change the font size, the color, and the background all at the same time, you don't need to create 3 separate CSS blocks. You can do it all in one. And that's the real power of CSS, is that you can keep your code concise and clean without having to create all of these different blocks. So this is pretty much the general rule. You have to follow this pretty much for all of the CSS you write, using a selector and then different properties contained inside of a block. So like I said, we're going to get much more experience with actually using CSS as we delve more into CSS and learning all of the different features it has to offer. Alright, let's move on. So this is the start of a new section, and now that we've learned all we need to know about selectors, we're going to actually start styling up our website and making it look good. So first of all, let's just talk about coloring in general. I mean, what is coloring and what are we supposed to do with it? So as we know, we already have a bunch of colors here and they all look fine, but what we're actually trying to do here is color our website in a way that makes it look modern and appealing to users. So we're going to be learning a bunch of different techniques that you can use to color your website. Now we've already used one in the past, and it's the very common one, and that is of course the color property. Now we're going to be talking more about this in the next video and using it in depth. But first thing I want to talk about is the different types of colors, because there's actually more than one. So first of all, we've all used, and well, you've at least seen me use the colors given by name. So for example, red, green, blue, and purple. But there's actually more than that. There's so much more to colors than just those names, because as you know, they're actually quite limiting. You can't really change the color and choose it as you want. So what I'm here to teach you about is the 3 different types of colors and how they work. So the first one is obviously the CSS color codes or names. And what they do is pretty much given a name, and they each have a designated color. So this is a really easy way for testing colors, for example, if you want to test if a property works, as we saw at the beginning of this course. And you can also use them for, maybe quick fixes or trying to just try out different colors. But once you get into the really specific, detailed web design and once you start producing your website properly, you're going to want more than just the color CSS gives you. So I've actually attached to the lecture resources this website here. You have a bunch of different CSS color codes, and you can see that there's actually a huge range of them. We only use the basic ones that are quite vibrant and they really hit the eyes very hard, but you can see there's actually a lot more than what we just used. The only problem is nobody wants to memorize all of these different names. So what we're actually going to be doing is learning how to use these two, which are the ones I'm going to be talking about in this video. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about hex code. Okay, so first of all, I have a color picker over here just to demonstrate how this whole thing works. We actually don't need this for now, so I'm gonna put this up on full screen. So this is a color picker that I found on Google. You can go ahead and search it anywhere, but I like using Google's provided one because it provides you with both the hex code and the RGB code. Don't worry, we'll talk about those in just a second. So first of all, you can slide up and down this thing and choose whichever color you want, and you can see that these two codes change. So what do they actually mean? Well, first, let's talk about the hex code. So we all know that when you're normally using numbers, you range from 0 to 9. So any given number in that numeral system can be made up of 0, 1, 2, and all the way up to 9. So in that case, there's 10 possible combinations. But in hex code, there's actually 16 different possible combinations. You can go from 0 to 9 and then A to F. So, for example, let's just take this right here. This can actually be converted into a number if we wanted to. Suppose B actually stands for 12 because it goes 0 to 9 and then A, B, so 12. And you can actually convert this into a number, which is very interesting. So I'm not really going to be talking about the applications of hex code in this video because that goes all the way down into computer science and we're not really looking at that now. But one thing we can do is actually create colors based on this. So first of all, you'll notice that our code here starts off with a hashtag and then you have 6 digits. So each one can have 16 possible combinations. But as we know, any color is made up of either red, green, or blue, at least on the computer for the standard color palette. So it's made up of red, green, and blue. Now, basically, this hex code is split up into 3 2-digit pairs. So the first pair of numbers is meant to represent the amount of red in the color, the second the amount of green, and the third the amount of blue, RGB. And these pairs can range from 00, which means none of that color, to FF, which is the highest value. Remember, hexadecimal goes from 0 to F. So I'm just going to choose something very basic here, like a standard blue. You can see here that this is the purest blue that you can get. Pretty much what this is saying is the first two is 00, which means there's no red. The second pair is also 00, which means no green, but then the third is FF, which means all blue. So this is pretty easy. So if we go to something like white, for example, this would have FF, which is all red, all green, all blue, which actually creates white. And if we chose black, you can see that that's 0. So this is a pretty hard thing to understand once you get into some of these more complicated colors. Again, we don't really use hexadecimal in normal use. When we're creating colors or writing code, we don't really use these numbers. So it's actually much easier to work with RGB codes. So RGB is a little bit different in the style that it's written, but it all represents the same concept. Pretty much, there are 3 numbers here, and these aren't hexadecimal numbers. These are just normal numbers. You have 3 numbers, the first for red, the second for green, and the third for blue. Just like this one, except in this case, the numbers can go from 0 to 255, 0 being the minimum and 255 being the maximum. So this is actually much easier to read. Let's go back to our blue here, and I'm actually just going to write the code here. So you can see that there's 0 red, 0 blue, and 0 red, 0 green, and 255 blue, which is the maximum. And obviously, you can see that once we go back to those complicated colors, when you look here, it's quite complicated to understand. But when we look at the RGB code, we can see that there's a moderate amount of red, a large amount of green, and a large amount of blue. And therefore, it should theoretically be a cold color. Now again, you don't really need to know how to construct these codes from your head. They're quite hard to understand. So what I would recommend is when you're designing these colors or designing these websites, I would recommend you just go and use a color picker. It's much easier to decide, and you can also get a lot more experience, hands-on experience with these colors rather than memorizing all the theory behind them. So both of these will work fine, and in the next video, I'm going to show you how to actually use these codes in our website and actually use them to style and color text. All right, let's move on. So in this video, I am going to be starting to color and style our website. So we're going to go through and use the selector skills that we've learned in the previous section to actually go through and start adding some color. On top of that, we're going to be using the skills we learned about hex code and RGB color codes to vary up our style or method of coloring things. Because in the past, like I've said, we've just used some basic techniques with CSS color codes, and now we're going to be working with our own custom colors. So first of all, let's go ahead and start adding some classes to this website to get it set up for our styling. So first thing I did is actually started from a clean slate because it was getting quite messy before, and I thought that it would be better if we started from scratch. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and add a class, or an ID actually I think would be better, to our title since there's only one of them. So I'm going to go ahead and add an ID of title. And hopefully you know how to do this from the skills you learned in the last section. Let's also go ahead and add some classes for our paragraph text. And because of course we have more than one paragraph, we're actually going to go ahead and use a class. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to say paragraph, or I'm just going to say para to shorten it, text. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this class onto our other paragraphs instead of writing it down. There we go. So the next thing I want to do is go ahead and add some classes to this list here just for convenience. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class for a list item. Now obviously we're not going to use all of these in one go, but I was just considering to add them so that when we get into it, we can actually go ahead and use them without having to go ahead and add these classes every single time. So there we go, we did that. Let's also go ahead and add a class to our link. And now we have our table items. We're going to leave this for now because it might take a long time. We'll style this when we get later into our section. So there we go, we did that. Now the last thing I want to do is just go ahead and add a couple classes to our inputs here. So I'm going to go ahead and add some classes. So class is form input. And this is actually quite commonplace to add or write class names and ID names with these. So with dashes instead of, snake case, which is using capital letters, things like that. It's just a convention in CSS. So let's go ahead and add the same class here. Just like that. There we go. And we're also going to go ahead and add a subtitle class to our subtitles. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. There we go. Let's just copy that and over to our other subtitles. And once we're done with that, we'll move on and start coloring our text. Right, there we go. So everything's looking good. That means nothing has gone wrong. Let's go ahead and start styling our text. So first thing I want to do is style our header here. So obviously you don't really want to go crazy with text colors. It's more for backgrounds, but I think we'll just experiment a little bit for this video with some of our colors. So first of all, I'm going to need to select it. This is the first part of our general rule. So because it's an ID, I'm going to go hash and then title, open up our block with our curly braces. And now we're going to start writing our property. So if you don't know this already, the property is going to be color. This is the text of the color of the text. And I know it doesn't look like it since it doesn't say text-color, similar to a bunch of other properties, but this is the way to color your text. So here we can go ahead and type our property, our value. Now before we've used colors like steel blue, which is a CSS color code. But now let's go ahead and challenge ourselves and start actually messing with these colors using our own color picker. So first of all, I want to choose a color that I really like. And I'm going to go for a sort of deep orange. So we don't want to go for something too dark, but we also don't want to go for something too light so that it's hard on the eyes. Now I think a color like this is good. Now how would we actually implement this? Well, we just copy and paste it, and if you're thinking that that's the right way, well, then you're right. It's actually very easy. All you have to do is copy your hex or RGB code and paste it into here, just like that. Now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that that color is being reflected on our title. Now I would recommend, instead of using your hex code, go ahead and add an RGB code. And I'll tell you why later in this section, but for now just think that this is better because it's a little bit more flexible and you can change it easily. So on top of that, using an RGB color code really allows you to mess around with the colors in a way that if you didn't know hex code, you wouldn't be able to. So for example, let's say I wanted to increase the amount of blue in this. All I would have to do is go ahead and just change it. Let's say I wanted to go with 150 blue. You can see that the color has completely changed by adding more blue. By doing it, we've kind of mixed around the colors and created this pinkish color. Imagine you're working with a color palette instead of a digital kind of weird color mixer. Think of, you have a giant pile of red, green, and blue, and what you're doing here is changing all of the proportions to get just the color you want. So let's go ahead and change this color back to 9. There we go. Now we have our orange color there. So let's go ahead and also style up our subtitles here. And one common thing that you do with hierarchies of text, so for example titles and then subtitles and paragraph, is usually your titles or your high up on the hierarchy are going to have very dark colors, and then your subtitles or things that are lower on the hierarchy are going to have around the same color scheme, but they're going to be a little lighter. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead to my color picker and drag this up a little bit. Of course, you could do this by just increasing all of the values, but I actually prefer to use the color picker because I could really see what's going on. So I'm going to choose something a little bit lighter, maybe something around here. Again, we don't want it to be too light because then it's going to be too hard on the eyes. So I think I'm going to go with something around here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the code. Now let's go ahead and add our selector. So I'm going to go dot subtitle, because remember it's a class. Then I'm going to use my property color and paste in our RGB color code. Let's go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see that our subtitles have been colored down. So there we go. Everything is working really well for now, and we're starting to get the hang of this. Now I recommend you go ahead and try this on your own. Again, the whole point is to be styling a website as you go along. So I recommend you go ahead and mess around with your own colors. Again, you can just find this color picker by going to Google. If you don't really like it, you could always go to another color picker on search for one. But you can go ahead, choose your own colors. If you don't like orange, you can go with blue, maybe something a little colder. It's totally up to you. Just get some practice with using colors on different types of text, and get some more practice using CSS on your own. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be covering background colors. Now, I know it's a little bit intimidating considering we've never actually done backgrounds before, but it's very similar to colors in the values that it uses. The only difference is what it's actually styling. So I'm going to be teaching you how to create backgrounds on your website. Now, obviously, we're not going to go all crazy and start creating backgrounds for everything because we haven't gotten into layout yet. And without layout, backgrounds aren't really usable because sometimes, especially with colors, it just doesn't really look that good. So what we're actually going to do is go through and just practice with our backgrounds for now. So the first thing I need to do is actually look for something to create a background on. And we all know what a background on text looked like. Now, we don't actually know why the background goes all the way to the edge yet. We haven't gotten into layout yet, but once we do, you'll know how to change that. For now though, I think it's really fitting to go through and style this whole page. So firstly, what selector do we need to use? Considering that we're trying to select everything, how are we supposed to create a background on every single item? Do we go through and select everything and add that background? Well, if we actually look at our HTML page, you can see that all of our text here is contained inside of our body tag. So the easiest way to select this, because again, there's only one of our body, we can just use an element selector. So I'm going to go ahead and select it with body. So usually you would actually put tags, element selectors at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Open up our block using those curly braces, and now we can add our background. So first of all, the property used to select and color backgrounds is called background color, but we're not actually going to use that because background is much easier considering that you can actually go and also select images and URLs instead of colors. It's much more flexible and I prefer using it over background color. So I'm going to go ahead and select that as my property. So from now, you can just go ahead and add your value. Similarly to color, you can use an RGB code, a hex code, or a CSS color even if you want. So I'm going to go ahead and set it as red and just warn your eyes because it's quite popping. So you can see that now our entire site has been styled red. Now obviously I don't want this. This doesn't really look very good. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this property for now. And we're going to go through and choose a color. So I would recommend choosing something a little bit light. So I'm going to go for about a light turquoise or light blue, something like this. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy my RGB code. And here I'm going to go ahead and add my background property and paste in my RGB code. Now if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see we have this really nice light blue, which kind of fits in with our oranges. Now, because it's a little bit, it doesn't really look that good on this light orange, I'm going to go ahead and dampen it a little bit. So the easy way to do this with RGB is to just go ahead and drop all of the values. This way you stay in the same proportions, but you're just darkening everything. So I'm going to go ahead and darken our subtitles. So I'm going to reduce everything by 20 or so. So this becomes, let's just say 200, and this becomes 148. And obviously these don't have to be exact. And this can become 30. So these don't have to be exact. Like I said, we're just darkening the titles. You can see that they got a little bit darker and it looks better on this color. All right, there we go. So that's pretty much how to style backgrounds. Now you can go ahead and apply this to pretty much anything you want. So if I actually go ahead and style our subtitles with our blue background, obviously it won't look that good, but it works perfectly fine. So there we go. That's pretty much how to add color to backgrounds. And in the next video, I'm going to be teaching you how to actually change the type of background that you're using. Because obviously sometimes you want to actually change the background and use maybe a custom image, or you want to link to an image online. So I'm going to be teaching you how to do that in the next video. So let's just go ahead and refresh the page, keep that normal. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be looking at a different type of background in CSS. So now that we've covered basic color types and we've also covered a little bit of background and using backgrounds, we're actually going to move on to an alternate way of creating backgrounds, and that's through background images. So right now we know the basics of coloring. So we're able to color text now with our own custom colors using a color picker. We can also go ahead and use our own backgrounds and things like that with our own colors. But now what I want to cover is looking at different types of backgrounds themselves. So in this case, we're going to be looking at images. So first of all, when we want to set the background to an image, we can't just go ahead and add an RGB color code. We're going to need to go and actually link to an image. So I'm going to show you a really easy way of doing this. The first thing we're going to need is an image. And for this method, you can actually use images from the internet without having to download them using URLs. So I'll show you how to do that now. So if I go ahead and search for a landscape image, just like this, and now we want to look for a sort of low resolution one. We don't want something too big. I think this would be pretty good. It's going to look a little bit weird, but just for this purpose, we're going to use it. So now what we need to do is get the URL link to this image. So you can do this by right-clicking on it, and then you're going to go ahead and click on copy image address. Okay, so what this is going to do is get the actual link to the image itself. Right now, this link is going to Google Images, but what we actually need is the link to the image itself. So there we go. We have that set up. Now we need to go ahead and add the image to the page. So under here, I'm going to just erase this color code for now, and I'm going to show you how to add our image. So there's this thing in CSS, they're called functions. Now, we're not really going to go very in-depth about them, but pretty much what they do is they take a few inputs, they process them, and they give an output. So the first example of a function that we've already used is this right here. It takes 3 inputs, a red, a green, and a blue, does some magic behind the scenes, and then gives us a color back. So what we're going to do here is use another function called URL. So what this is going to do is take in the link or to a URL, and then it's going to find that image and set it. So in quotations, it does have to be in quotations, just remember that. You're then going to paste in your image. So remember, I just copied this from the image address, and now we have it here.